In the spring of 1943, the 7th Airdrome outside Port Moresby, New Guinea, was not a place where you went to win a war. It was a place where machines went to die. The tropical heat sat on the runway like a physical weight, baking the aluminum skins of the aircraft until they were too hot to touch. The air smelled of gas, rotting jungle vegetation, and the sour sweat of men who hadn't slept in a week. At the far end of the tarmac, away from the active flight line, sat the boneyard. This was the elephant graveyard of the 5th Air Force. It was a collection of broken B-17 bombers that had been chewed up by Japanese fighters and spit out by the sky. Some had missing wings. Others had fuselages that looked like Swiss cheese. They were stripped for parts, scavenged by mechanics to keep the few flying planes in the air. Sitting in the middle of this scrap heap was a plane that even the scavengers avoided. It was B-17 serial number 41 to 2666. The tail number ended in 666. To a superstitious airman, that was enough reason to walk away. But the curse of this plane went deeper than a number. It had a reputation. It had arrived in the Pacific with a heavy tail section that made it fly like a dump truck. It was sluggish. It was unresponsive. The pilots who had tried to fly it said it wallowed in the air. It didn't want to climb. It didn't want to fight. It had been parked in the boneyard and forgotten, left to rot in the rain while the war moved on without it. The ground crews called it a hangar queen. The experts said it was garbage. They said the only thing it was good for was scrap metal. But Captain Jay Zeamer was not an expert. He was a problem. Zeamer was a pilot who didn't fit the mold of a standard Army Air Forces officer. He was 34 years old, older than most of the kids flying the heavy iron. He had a reputation for being difficult. He didn't like flying in formation. He didn't like waiting for orders. He had a condition that made it impossible for him to sleep for long periods. So he spent his nights wandering the flight line with a flashlight, looking at engines, studying maps, looking for something to do. The brass called him an eager beaver, which in the military is not a compliment. It means you are a loose cannon. It means you take risks that aren't calculated. Zeamer had been floating around the squadron without a crew and without a plane. Nobody wanted to fly with him because he was too aggressive. Nobody wanted to give him a plane because he would probably break it. So he spent his time in the boneyard. He looked at the neglected airframe. He didn't see a pile of junk. He saw a project. He saw a heavy, stable platform that nobody else wanted. He knew that in a war where planes were scarce, a pilot with his own bomber, even a broken one, was his own boss. He could volunteer for the missions nobody else wanted. He could fly on his own terms. He started spending his days working on the cursed plane. He cleaned the spark plugs. He patched the holes in the aluminum skin with scraps of metal from other wrecks. He tuned the engines until they stopped coughing and started roaring. He treated the discarded machine like a classic car restoration. The other pilots laughed at him. They asked him why he was wasting his time on a lemon. They asked him if he planned to taxi it into combat because it certainly wasn't going to fly. Zeamer ignored them. He was building something. But a pilot is nothing without a crew. And no sane airman would volunteer to fly in a cursed plane with a pilot who couldn't sleep. So Zeamer recruited the insane ones. He went to the bar. He went to the brig. He looked for the men who were on the verge of being court-martialed or kicked out. He looked for the screw-ups. He found Joseph Sarnosky, a bombardier who was arguably the best shot in the Pacific but had a reputation for insubordination. Sarnosky was a man who hated discipline but loved to fight. He became Zeamer's right hand. Together, they went through the roster like shoppers at a discount store. They found a navigator who had been rejected by other crews. They found gunners who had attitude problems. They assembled a collection of misfits, renegades, and cast-offs. This was the Eager Beavers crew. They were the bad news bears of the 5th Air Force. While Zeamer was building his Frankenstein plane, the war in the Pacific was hitting a wall. The American forces were trying to push north toward the Philippines, but there was a massive obstacle in their path: the island of Bougainville. It was a Japanese fortress, a jagged volcanic rock covered in jungle and ringed with airfields. The Japanese had turned it into a hornet's nest. They had hundreds of Zero fighters stationed there. They had anti-aircraft guns covering every approach. Intelligence knew that if the Americans tried to invade Bougainville without knowing exactly where the guns were, it would be a massacre. They needed a map. They needed detailed, high-resolution photographs of the coastlines, the reefs, and the airfields. But getting those photos was considered impossible. To map the island, a plane would have to fly straight and level for 20 minutes. It would have to fly in daylight, and it would have to fly alone. A formation of bombers would be too slow and attract too much attention. A single fighter didn't have the range or the cameras. It had to be a heavy bomber. The generals looked at the mission profile and saw a suicide note. Sending a single B-17 over Bougainville in broad daylight was like sending a slow cow to swim through a tank of piranhas. The Japanese Zeros would swarm it. They would cut it to pieces before the photographer could even open the shutter. The mission was circulated through the squadrons. Every experienced pilot turned it down. They weren't cowards. They were just good at math. 1 bomber versus 100 Zeros equals 0 survivors. Command was stuck. They needed the photos, but they couldn't order a crew to commit suicide. They needed volunteers. Jay Zeamer heard about the mission. He was standing on the tarmac, wiping grease off his hands, looking at his resurrected bomber. He looked at Sarnosky. They didn't do the math. They didn't think about the odds. They thought about the opportunity. This was the ticket. If they volunteered for the impossible run, the brass would have to let them fly. They would have to let them take the boneyard bomber into combat. Zeamer walked into the operations tent and put his name on the list. The operations officer looked at him like he was crazy. He looked at the tail number of the plane Zeamer intended to fly. He tried to talk him out of it. He explained that the plane was a dog. He explained that the Japanese defenses on Bougainville were the densest in the Solomon Islands. He explained that nobody had ever flown a mapping run over that sector and come back alive. Zeamer just smiled. He said his crew was ready. He said his plane was ready. He said he would get the pictures or he wouldn't come back. The officer stamped the papers. He probably thought he was signing a death certificate. But Zeamer wasn't planning to go over Bougainville in a standard B-17. He knew the experts were right about one thing. A standard bomber would be slaughtered. A standard B-17 had blind spots. It had weak points. The Japanese pilots knew these weaknesses. They knew that if they attacked from the front, straight at the nose, the bomber had very little firepower to stop them. The standard nose gun was a small .30 caliber machine gun that couldn't hit hard enough or far enough to stop a charging Zero. It was a defensive weapon meant to scare planes away, not kill them. Zeamer knew that if he was going to survive a solo run, he didn't need to scare them. He needed to destroy them. He went back to the boneyard and told his crew to grab wrenches and welding torches. They were going to do something strictly against regulations. They were going to modify the airframe. The manual said the B-17 carried 10 machine guns. Zeamer decided that wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted a flying battleship. They scavenged guns from wrecked planes. They found heavy .50 caliber machine guns, the kind that could punch through an engine block at half a mile. They started cutting holes in the fuselage of the resurrected wreck. They mounted guns in the waist windows. They mounted guns in the floor. They doubled the firepower, but the biggest change was in the nose. Zeamer wanted a gun he could fire himself. He wanted to turn the heavy bomber into a fighter. He found a fixed gun mount, usually used on attack aircraft, and bolted a .50 caliber machine gun directly to the floor of the cockpit, aiming forward through the nose glass. He rigged a trigger to the control yoke. This was insane. A B-17 pilot is supposed to fly the plane, not shoot. The engineers would have screamed if they had seen it. They would have said the recoil would crack the glass. They would have said the weight would throw off the center of gravity. They would have said it was impossible to aim a 30-ton bomber like a rifle. Zeamer didn't care what the engineers thought. He sat in the cockpit and sighted the gun. He imagined a Japanese Zero coming at him head-on. He imagined the surprise on the enemy pilot's face when the helpless bomber started spitting heavy lead from the nose. He knew that the only way to survive the swarm was to be the porcupine. He told Sarnosky to mount another .50 caliber in the nose on a flexible mount so the bombardier could sweep the sky. They packed the plane with ammunition. They loaded the cameras. They filled the fuel tanks to the brim. On the morning of the mission, the flying battleship sat on the runway, heavy and menacing. It looked different, bristling with 19 machine guns, nearly double the standard loadout. It sat low on its landing gear, groaning under the weight of the extra steel and lead. The other crews watched them prepare. There were no jokes this time, only quiet, somber respect. It was the kind of look you give a man walking to the electric chair. They knew where Zeamer was going. They knew he was flying a piece of junk into the heart of the enemy empire. They didn't expect to see him again. Zeamer fired up the engines. They caught with a smoky roar. The plane vibrated, felt heavy, felt like a brick. But as he pushed the throttles forward, the old bomber began to roll. It gathered speed, sluggish at first, then faster. The trees at the end of the runway rushed closer. For a second, it looked like they wouldn't make it. The weight was too much. The curse was pulling them down. But then Zeamer pulled back on the yoke. The wheels left the ground. The heavy iron clawed its way into the humid air, shaking off the dust of the boneyard. They were airborne. They turned north toward the mountains, toward Bougainville, and toward a destiny the experts said was impossible. They were a ghost plane flown by a ghost crew, heading into a fight that would rewrite the history books. The flight to Bougainville was not a journey. It was a physical argument between the laws of aerodynamics and the stubborn will of the crew. The flying warehouse was heavy. With 19 machine guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, full fuel tanks, and heavy mapping cameras, the bomber felt less like an aircraft and more like a flying warehouse. It wallowed through the air. Every time Captain Jay Zeamer touched the controls, the plane hesitated before responding, as if it were thinking about whether it really wanted to turn. The engines droned with a deep, throttling vibration that shook the fillings in the crew's teeth. They were climbing slowly, clawing for altitude inch by inch, heading north over the Solomon Sea toward the most dangerous island in the Pacific. Inside the fuselage, the air grew colder with every 1,000 feet of altitude. At 20,000 feet, the tropical heat of New Guinea was a distant memory, replaced by a sub-zero chill that bit through leather flight jackets and numbed fingers. The crew moved through the plane, checking the modifications the experts had said would never work. They were essentially test pilots for a machine that shouldn't exist. They were checking the porcupine they had built with stolen parts and welding torches. The waist gunners stood in the center of the plane, surrounded by a carpet of ammunition belts. In a standard B-17, the waist guns were the primary defense, but they were often crowded and hard to aim. On this plane, the crew had ripped out the standard mounts and built their own. They had raided wreckage for extra feed chutes and spare barrels. They had mounted twin guns where there used to be singles. They had cut extra holes in the floor and mounted heavy .50 caliber machine guns pointing downward, covering the belly blind spot that Japanese fighters loved to exploit. It looked like a junkyard inside, a chaotic mess of steel and brass, but it was chaos designed for murder. The most radical piece of engineering was in the nose. In a normal bomber, the nose is the office of the bombardier and the navigator. It is a glass bubble designed for looking at maps and aiming bombs, not for fighting. The standard defensive gun was a small, flexible .30 caliber machine gun that looked like a toy compared to the heavy cannons on Japanese fighters. It was like bringing a pistol to a rifle fight. Zeamer knew the Japanese pilots were smart. They knew the B-17's nose was weak. They were trained to attack head-on, flying straight at the cockpit glass, knowing the Americans couldn't shoot back with enough power to stop them. Zeamer had fixed that problem with a wrench and a refusal to follow the rules. He sat in the pilot's seat, gripping the control yoke. Bolted to the floor in front of him, extending through the nose cone, was a fixed .50 caliber machine gun. It wasn't on a swivel. It wasn't aimed by a gunner. It was aimed by the plane itself. Zeamer had rigged a trigger switch onto his flight controls. If he wanted to shoot a Japanese plane, he didn't call for a gunner. He simply turned the entire bomber until the enemy was in the window and squeezed the trigger. He had turned a 4-engine bomber into the world's biggest, slowest fighter plane. Beside him in the nose, Bombardier Joseph Sarnosky manned another heavy .50 caliber on a flexible mount. They had turned the glass bubble into a turret. As they approached the coastline of Bougainville, The mood in the plane shifted from tension to cold, professional focus. The island appeared on the horizon, a green stain on the blue ocean. It looked peaceful from a distance, but the crew knew better. That green jungle was hiding an army. The airfields carved into the coast were hives of Zero fighters, the Mitsubishi A6M. The Zero was a predator. It was fast, agile, and climbed like a rocket. It was made of lightweight aluminum and had no armor, which made it fragile. But in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was a samurai sword. It could cut a heavy American bomber to ribbons. Zeamer leveled the plane off at 25,000 feet. He checked his compass. He checked his airspeed. This was the moment of maximum danger. To get the photos, they had to fly in a straight line. They couldn't weave. They couldn't dodge. They had to be a stable platform for the cameras mounted in the belly. They had to fly straight and level over the enemy's territory for 20 minutes. It was like walking a tightrope while someone threw rocks at you. Zeamer keyed the intercom. He told the crew to keep their eyes open. He told them to watch the sun. Japanese fighters loved to hide in the glare, diving out of the blinding light to ambush their prey. The cameras started clicking. The big lenses in the belly of the plane began snapping high-resolution images of the reefs, the beaches, and the jungle trails. Every click was a piece of intelligence that would save marine lives during the invasion. But every second that passed was another second the Japanese radar operators were tracking them. The silence in the headsets was heavy. It was the sound of men holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. They were alone. There were no friendly fighters to protect them. There was no backup. If they got into trouble, the nearest help was 400 miles away. Then the voice of the tail gunner crackled over the intercom. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. He just said the words every bomber crew dreads. Contacts, 6 o'clock low. Climbing. Zeamer looked back. He couldn't see them yet, but he knew what was happening. The Japanese had scrambled. They weren't sending a patrol. They were sending a swarm. The tail gunner started counting. 1, 2, 5, 10. The numbers kept going up. 17 fighters were rising from the jungle airfields like a cloud of angry wasps. They were climbing fast, their engines screaming as they clawed for altitude to intercept the lone intruder. The experts would have said this was the moment to abort. A sane pilot would have shoved the throttles to the firewall, dropped the nose, and dove for cloud cover. One bomber against 17 fighters is not a battle. It is an execution. But Zeamer didn't turn. He didn't dive. He held the line. He needed the photos. He told Sarnowski to keep the cameras rolling. He told the gunners to check their feeds. He was going to finish the run. The Japanese pilots must have been confused. They saw a single B-17 plodding along in the clear sky. It wasn't running away. It wasn't maneuvering. It looked like a training target. They probably laughed. They probably radioed each other, claiming the kill before they even fired a shot. They split into groups, setting up their attack runs. They were methodical. They were going to dissect the bomber. The lead flight of Zeros swung around to the front. They were going to execute the classic 12 o'clock high attack. They climbed above the bomber, turned, and dove straight at the nose. This was the textbook move. They knew the B-17 was weak in the front. They planned to scream in head-on, raking the cockpit with their 20mm cannon, killing the pilots and shattering the glass, then peeling away before the slow American turrets could track them. It was a move that had worked 100 times before. Zeamer watched the lead Zero turn. He saw the wings level out. He saw the sun glinting off the canopy. The Japanese pilot was coming straight down the pipe, committed to the collision course. Zeamer didn't flinch. He didn't bank away to avoid the fire. Instead, he did something the Japanese pilot never expected. He turned the bomber toward the fighter. He used the rudder pedals to skid the heavy plane, lining up the nose like a sniper aiming a rifle. The Japanese pilot was closing at 400 miles per hour. He was waiting until he was in cannon range. He was looking at the glass nose of the bomber, expecting to see a terrified pilot trying to hide. Instead, he saw the muzzle of a heavy machine gun pointing directly at his face. Zeamer waited until the Zero was filling the windshield, until he could see the propeller spinning. He squeezed the trigger on the yoke.
The fixed .50 caliber machine gun in the nose roared. The recoil shook the entire cockpit floor. A stream of heavy lead slugs mixed with armor-piercing incendiary rounds erupted from the nose of the bomber. This wasn't scattered defensive fire. This was accurate heavy fire. The rounds slammed into the lead Zero. They didn't just poke holes. They smashed the engine block. They tore the wings apart. The Japanese fighter disintegrated in midair. 1 second it was a lethal machine diving for the kill. The next it was a ball of fire and debris tumbling past Zeamer's window. The explosion shocked the Japanese squadron. They had flown into a trap. This wasn't a helpless old bomber. It was a predator in disguise. Sarnosky opened fire with his flexible nose gun, catching the second Zero as it tried to break away. His bullets sawed through the enemy fuselage, sending smoke trailing into the sky. But the surprise only lasted a second. The remaining Zeros were professionals. They realized the game had changed, and they reacted with fury. They abandoned textbook attacks and swarmed the bomber from every angle. They came from the sides, from above, from below. The sky around the lone bomber turned into a storm of tracers. 20mm cannon shells slammed into the wings, punching holes the size of dinner plates. Bullets ripped through the aluminum skin, sounding like hail on a tin roof. The interior of the bomber became a slaughterhouse. The waist gunners slipped on thousands of spent brass casings that littered the floor. The air was thick with the smell of burning cordite and hydraulic fluid. Sarnosky fought like a madman in the nose, swinging his gun from side to side, calling out targets. A cannon shell exploded against the nose glass, blowing Sarnosky backward. He was hit. Shrapnel tore into his stomach. He collapsed onto the floor, blood pooling on the metal deck. Zeamer looked over. His friend was down. The nose was open to the wind, a jagged hole where the glass had been. The wind roared into the cockpit, a hurricane of cold air and noise. Zeamer felt a sledgehammer blow to his leg. A bullet had punched through the fuselage and shattered his knee. Another hit his wrist. His flight suit was soaking with blood. The controls felt heavy and sluggish. The hydraulic system was shot. The oxygen system was leaking. But the plane was still flying. The engines were still turning. And Sarnosky wasn't done. The bombardier dragged himself up from the floor. He was mortally wounded, bleeding to death, but he crawled back to his gun. He pulled himself up, gripping the handles with white knuckles. He looked out through the shattered nose at the swarm of fighters circling for the next pass. He didn't look like a dying man. He looked like a man who had decided that if he was going to hell, he wasn't going alone. He racked the charging handle on his machine gun and pointed it at the sky. Zeamer gritted his teeth against the pain in his legs and shoved the throttles forward. He wasn't turning back. They still had photos to take. The Zeros regrouped, diving again, angry now, determined to finish off the crippled giant. They thought the bomber was dead. They thought the crew was finished. They were about to find out the Porcupine was just getting warmed up. The battle over the coast of Bougainville devolved into a street fight at 25,000 feet. The Japanese pilots were furious. They had raked the American bomber with cannon fire, riddled it with machine gun bullets, and blown holes in the fuselage big enough to crawl through. By all the laws of aviation, the B-17 should have been falling in flames. It should have been a smoking crater in the jungle. But the battered giant was still flying. It was shaking, rattling, and leaking fluids, but the 4 Wright Cyclone engines were still churning, dragging the wounded airframe through the sky. And worse for the Japanese, the dying crew was shooting back. Captain Jay Zeamer was fighting a war on 2 fronts. One against the enemy planes outside his window, the other against his own body. A Japanese bullet had smashed through the cockpit floor and shattered his left knee. Another had torn through his wrist. He was losing blood fast. His flight suit was heavy and wet. The pain was a blinding, white-hot pulse that threatened to make him pass out. But he couldn't pass out. If he let go of the yoke, the heavy bomber would roll over and spin into the sea. He had to fly the plane with 1 good hand and 1 good leg. He wedged his broken leg against the rudder pedal, using his dead weight to keep the plane trimmed. He ignored the blood pooling on the floor. He focused on the Zeros. The Japanese pilots had learned that attacking from the front was suicide. The fixed-nose gun had taught them a lethal lesson, so they changed tactics. They split up, circling the bomber like wolves, looking for a weak flank. They attacked from the sides, the rear, and below. They tried to overwhelm the gunners with sheer numbers. They came in waves, 3 or 4 at a time, their wings flashing with muzzle fire. But Zeamer's unauthorized modifications were waiting. When a flight of Zeros dove on the waist, expecting standard single guns, they were met by a wall of lead from twin-mounted .50 calibers. The American gunners weren't firing defensive bursts. They were pouring continuous fire into the enemy. The waist was chaos. Spent brass rolled across the floor like marbles. The gunners shouted targets, swinging heavy guns on custom mounts, tracking fast-moving fighters through smoke-choked air. In the nose, Joseph Sarnosky was dying. The wound in his stomach was fatal. He knew it. The crew knew it. He had collapsed earlier, but the sound of the guns dragged him back. A Japanese fighter, thinking the nose gunner was dead, made a slow, arrogant pass across the front of the bomber, banking to expose its belly. It was a fatal mistake. Sarnosky opened fire. He didn't have the strength for perfect aim, but he had instinct. He walked the tracers into the Zero's fuel tank. The Japanese plane exploded in a flash of orange fire. Sarnosky slumped against the bulkhead, exhausted, but kept his hand on the trigger. He refused to leave his post. The battle dragged on. 5 minutes. 10. 15. In air combat, dogfights last seconds. This was a marathon. The Japanese were relentless. They shot out the hydraulic system, killing the landing gear and brakes. They shot out the oxygen system. At 25,000 feet, the air is too thin to breathe. Without oxygen, a man passes out in minutes. Zeamer understood the danger. He had to get down. But a steep dive would carry them into the teeth of anti-aircraft guns. He pushed the nose into a shallow, high-speed descent, trading altitude for speed, trying to outrun the swarm. The heavy bomber accelerated, the airframe groaning under stress. Wind roared through the shattered nose, freezing the blood on Sarnosky's uniform. With hydraulics gone, Zeamer was flying on pure mechanical linkage. He had to muscle the 30-ton bomber through the sky. Every correction sent shocks of agony through his shattered leg. The Japanese followed them down. They sensed the kill. They saw the smoke trailing from the No. 3 engine. They saw pieces of metal falling off the tail. They pressed the attack that a Zero came in from the tail, sitting in the blind spot, pouring cannon fire into the rudder. The tail gunner, Sergeant Pudgy, was waiting. He had been quiet, conserving his ammo. Now he opened up. He didn't just fire. He surgically dismantled the attacker. He shot the propeller off the Zero. The Japanese plane stalled and fell away. Another Zero tried to attack from below, aiming for the ball turret, but the ball turret gunner was already tracking him. He spun the turret, following the fighter as it climbed. He waited until the Zero was close, then unleashed a long burst. The Japanese plane flew straight into the stream of bullets. The engine block shattered. The pilot bailed out, his parachute popping open white against the blue sky. The crew of the Flying Fortress was methodical. They weren't panicking. They were angry. They had been sent to die in a junk plane, and they were taking it personally. They were making the Japanese pay for every inch of sky. They had shot down 2 fighters, then 3, then 4. The Japanese squadron was losing planes faster than they could believe. They had never seen a bomber fight like this. It was like fighting a battleship that could fly. Zeamer checked his watch. They had been fighting for 40 minutes. 40 minutes of continuous combat. The ammunition was running low. The gunners were shouting that their barrels were overheating. The plane was barely holding together. The instrument panel was smashed. The radio was dead. The rudder cables were frayed, hanging by a few strands of wire, and Zeamer was fading. The blood loss was making him dizzy. His vision was tunneling. He could see the horizon, but the edges of the world were turning gray. He slapped his own face to stay awake. He couldn't die yet. He had to get them home. The Japanese finally broke off. They were low on fuel. They were low on ammo, and frankly, they were terrified. They had thrown 17 of their best fighters at a single broken American bomber, and the bomber had beaten them. They had lost 5 planes confirmed, with others damaged. They turned back toward Bougainville, leaving the smoking, battered hulk of the fortress alone in the sky. But the battle wasn't over. The fight against the enemy was done, but the fight against the plane was just starting. Zeamer leveled off at 10,000 feet. He looked around the cockpit. It was a wreck. Glass was everywhere. Blood was everywhere. Sarnowski was unconscious in the nose, barely breathing. The other crew members were wounded. The navigator tried to patch up Zeamer's leg with a first aid kit, but the wound was too deep. Zeamer waved him away. He pointed to the map. He needed a course for home. Port Moresby was 400 miles away. That's a long flight in a brand new plane, and a plane with shot-out engines. No hydraulics, and a pilot bleeding to death. It's an eternity. The flight back was a blur of pain and silence. Zeamer drifted in and out of consciousness. He would black out for a second. The plane would dip, and the adrenaline would snap him back awake. He hallucinated. He thought he saw Zeros in the clouds. He thought he saw the runway, but it was just the ocean. The crew tried to help him. The co-pilot offered to take the controls, but Zeamer refused. He knew the plane better than anyone. He knew its quirks. He knew that with the damage to the control cables, a heavy hand would snap the wires and kill them all. He had to fly it himself. He had to feel the plane. He flew with his fingertips, sensing the vibrations, coaxing the dying machine to stay in the air. They crossed the coast of New Guinea. The mountains of the Owen Stanley Range rose in front of them. Zeamer had to climb to clear the pass. He pushed the throttles forward. The engines protested. The temperature gauges redlined. The oil pressure dropped, but the old engines held. They climbed over the jagged peaks, clearing the trees by feet. The airfield at Port Moresby appeared in the distance. It was the most beautiful sight Zeamer had ever seen. But now he had a new problem. No hydraulics meant no brakes and no flaps. He would have to land the heavy bomber at high speed. And once he touched down, he wouldn't be able to stop. And he had one good leg to work the rudder. He called the tower, and no answer. The radio was dead. He fired a red flare from the cockpit window to signal an emergency. The ground crews saw the battered plane approaching and cleared the runway. Fire trucks raced to the tarmac. Ambulances waited. Zeamer lined up the approach. The plane was coming in hot. He cut the power. The crippled bomber dropped toward the ground. Zeamer fought the crosswind. He had to keep the wings level. If a wingtip caught the ground at that speed, the plane would cartwheel and explode. He flared the nose. The main wheels hit the runway with a screech of rubber. The plane bounced. It settled. It was rolling fast, eating up the tarmac. Zeamer stomped on the rudder pedal with his good leg, trying to keep it straight. He didn't have brakes, so he let friction do the work. The plane rolled and rolled. It reached the end of the runway. It rolled into the dirt. It finally ground to a stop in a cloud of dust, just feet from the jungle's edge. The silence that followed was deafening. The engines sputtered and died. The props stopped turning. Zeamer slumped over the yoke. He had done it. He had brought them back. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness finally take him. He didn't hear the sirens. He didn't hear the mechanics shouting as they ran toward the plane. He didn't see the horror on their faces when they saw the condition of the aircraft. The plane looked like it had been fed into a meat grinder. There were hundreds of bullet holes. The nose was gone. The tail was shredded. It was a miracle the pieces had stayed together long enough to land. The medics pulled Zeamer out of the cockpit. He was unconscious, pale as a sheet. They pulled Sarnowski from the nose. He was still alive, but barely. He looked at the pilot being loaded onto a stretcher. He whispered something, but nobody heard it. The rest of the crew stumbled out of the waste door, kissing the ground. They looked at their plane. It was leaking oil and fuel into the dirt. It looked like a corpse, but it was the corpse that had saved their lives. They had flown into the mouth of hell, spat in the devil's eye, and walked back out. The misfit crew had done the impossible, but the cost was high. The real fight for Jay Zeamer and Joe Sarnowski was just beginning in the hospital tent. The war was over for them, but the legend of the boneyard bomber was just being born. When the dust settled on the runway at Port Moresby, the silence around the shattered plane was heavier than the battle's noise. The ground crews stopped 10 feet away, staring in disbelief. They were used to seeing damaged planes. They were used to patching bullet holes and replacing engine cowlings. But this was different. The bomber looked like it had been used for target practice by the entire Japanese Navy. There wasn't a single square foot of aluminum that wasn't dented, torn, or perforated. The tail section hung by shreds of metal. The rudder was gone. The wings looked like lace. The nose, the glass office where Joe Sarnosky had fought his last battle, was completely shattered, open to the air, covered in blood and spent brass casings. The mechanics started counting the holes. They stopped at 100, then at 150. The final count was staggering. There were 187 bullet holes and 5 large cannon shell holes in the fuselage. That was just the damage they could see. Inside, the plane was a wreck. The control cables were frayed to the last wire. The hydraulic lines were severed. The oxygen tanks were punctured. By every rule of engineering, the plane should have broken apart midair. The main wing spar, the solid steel beam holding the wings to the body, was cracked. If Zeamer had pulled the yoke a little harder during landing, the wings would have snapped off. The plane hadn't flown back on aerodynamics. It had flown back on will. The medics pulled the crew from the wreckage. It was grim. Captain Zeamer was unconscious. His flight suit soaked in. Blood from the waist down. His leg was ruined. The doctors didn't think he would survive the night. He had lost half his blood volume. He had flown a 30-ton bomber for 2 hours while bleeding to death. Bombardier Joseph Sarnosky was lifted out next. He was still alive, but barely. He had taken a 20mm cannon shell to the stomach. In any other situation, he would have collapsed instantly. But he had stayed at his gun, fighting off the Zeros, protecting his pilot until the guns fell silent. He died. Shortly after being pulled from the plane. He held on just long enough to finish the mission. While surgeons fought to save Zeamer in the hospital tent, intelligence officers rushed the film canisters to the photo lab. This was the reason for the blood. This was why Sarnosky had died. If the photos were blurry or the cameras destroyed, the mission was a failure. The technicians developed the film in the darkroom, hands shaking. They hung the negatives to dry. They examined the images through magnifying glasses. The photos were perfect. Despite evasive maneuvers, despite gun vibrations, despite the damage, Zeamer had held the bomber steady enough to capture crystal-clear images of the Bougainville coast. The photos revealed everything. Hidden gun emplacements, the depth of the reefs, the locations of Japanese airfields. It was the impossible map the generals had demanded. Those photos became the blueprint for invasion. When U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Bougainville later that year, they knew exactly where to go. They knew where the bunkers were. Countless American lives were saved because a misfit crew refused to turn back when the sky turned black with fighters. Jay Zeamer didn't wake for days. He lay in a coma, his body fighting shock and infection. When he finally opened his eyes, he was weak, unable to move his legs. The doctors told him he might never walk again. They told him Sarnosky was gone. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Zeamer had built the crew. He had modified the plane, and he had led them into the fire. He felt the weight of command, the heavy burden of the survivor. But then news began to trickle in from the rest of the squadron. The story of the dogfight had spread. Other pilots were talking about the porcupine that had fought off 17 Zeros. They were talking about the nose gun. They were talking about the crew that didn't know how to die. The Army Air Forces couldn't ignore what had happened. The experts who had called the plane a piece of junk and the crew screw-ups were silenced by the sheer magnitude of the victory. They had to rewrite the record books. The Eager Beavers became the most decorated squad in the Pacific Theater. Every single man on the plane received a medal, but the highest honors were reserved for the pilot and the bombardier. Captain Jay Zeamer and Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnosky were both awarded the Medal of Honor. It is the highest military decoration the United States can bestow. It is rare for 2 men on the same plane to receive it for the same mission. It speaks to the intensity of the fight. The citation spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life, but the words on paper couldn't capture the reality of that cockpit. They couldn't capture the sound of the wind screaming through the shattered nose or the feeling of the controls fighting against a dead leg. Zeamer received the medal in the hospital. He was still in a cast, looking thin and frail, a stark contrast to the heavy bomber he had wrestled through the sky. He accepted it not for himself, but for Sarnosky. As for the legendary machine, the plane itself, its war was over. The mechanics looked at the damage and shook their heads. It was beyond repair. You couldn't patch it this time. The structural damage was too severe. It was towed back to the boneyard, to the scrap heap where Zeamer had found it. But this time, it wasn't parked with junk. It was parked with reverence. It sat under the tropical sun, its aluminum skin fading, its guns removed, a silent monument to the violence of 1943. Pilots walked out to look at it. They ran their hands over the jagged holes.
They looked at the fixed gun mount in the cockpit floor and shook their heads that it was a machine that had done the impossible simply because the men inside refused to accept that it couldn't be done. Jay Zeamer defied the doctors just as he had defied the Japanese. He learned to walk again. It took time. It took pain. And it took the same stubbornness that had kept him in the air. But he got back on his feet. He survived the war. He returned to the United States. A quiet hero in a country celebrating victory. He didn't write books. He didn't go on speaking tours. He lived a modest life. He worked in the aviation industry, staying close to the machines he loved. He eventually moved to Maine, settled down, and raised a family. If you met him in his later years, you wouldn't know he was a legend. He was just a kind, soft-spoken old man who liked to sit on his porch. He didn't brag about taking on an entire enemy air force alone. He didn't brag about the Medal of Honor. He kept it in a drawer. But in quiet moments, he must have thought back to that runway in Port Moresby. He must have remembered the smell of grease and the sound of radial engines coughing to life. He must have remembered the faces of the misfits, the men nobody else wanted who turned out to be the best crew in the world. Jay Zeamer passed away in 2007. He was 88 years old. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Army Air Forces. With his death, the final link to that terrible, glorious day over Bougainville was broken. But stories outlive the people who live them. The story of that impossible plane is still told in flight schools and mess halls. It is studied by historians. It is whispered by mechanics. We tell it today because it's easy to get hypnotized by specs and spreadsheets. On paper, serial number 666 should have been scrap metal. The manual said it was too slow, too shot up, and flown by the wrong kind of crew. But the numbers never accounted for a pilot who refused to quit and a bombardier who kept firing while bleeding out in the nose. You can measure horsepower and wing loading. You can't measure spite, loyalty, or sheer stubborn rage. Jay Zeamer and his renegades proved that a cursed plane is only cursed if you believe it is. They proved that a misfit is just a hero who hasn't found his fight yet. They took a broken machine and a broken reputation and forged them into a weapon that shattered Japanese defenses. They reminded us that, in the end, it's not the plane that makes the ace, it's the ace that makes the plane. So the next time you feel the odds stacked against you, the next time experts say your plan is crazy or your equipment is junk, remember the porcupine. Remember the 19 guns. Remember the solo run. And remember that as long as you have enough fuel to fly and enough courage to pull the trigger, you are never out of the fight. If this story of the bomber that wouldn't die fired you up, smash that like button. It helps us find more lost legends in the archives. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the history left out of the textbooks. And tell us in the comments another example of a cursed weapon that became a legend. We read every single one. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering the cursed bomber. Stay safe and keep flying.